So as you know, once again, I'm John Collins. I'm here as acting as the city attorney. We talked about this yesterday. We discussed a handful of issues regarding the contract to sort of provide a timeline. So this morning, I made some changes to the contract that you saw yesterday in light of the council's discussion last night, and also in light of the negotiations that I had earlier in the day with YMCA Council, who's here tonight. After sending those changes to YMCA Council, they responded with a series of proposals, and we've sort of been negotiating throughout the day. You also received a version of the contract that I made this morning. The contract you have now is one that I have made some changes to, and there are sort of two categories of changes. The first category of changes are changes as a result of agreements that we were able to arrive at with YMCA Council. The second category are, I guess, what I would term as remaining issues. In other words, there are a handful of issues that we were unable to come to an agreement with YMCA Council, and so I think the most efficient thing to do would be to go through those issues and have the council reach a consensus on each one. And once we've done that, we should be able to finalize the contract and hopefully act on it tonight, because I know there's a strong desire to get this contract approved and out the door so we can move this project forward. So with that in mind, I've made a grid of the remaining issues that are left, and to sort of provide some context, we just need to sort of clarify what language the council wants to adopt in the contract. And we're fortunate enough to have the YMCA Council here, and to the extent possible, I think his input would be helpful, just so we can make sure that whatever the council adopts, we know we can move forward with and ultimately approve the contract. So without further ado, the very first issue is the traffic impact analysis, which is on page 2, and it's under 1B. And the language appears sort of in the middle of the paragraph, and this is regarding off-site improvements. And before, it had read that no off-site improvements will be required except for any improvements required by the Shelton Municipal Code and State Environmental Policy Act or a traffic impact analysis. YMCA Council indicated to me that they were not comfortable with that language, and they would rather have this proposal that I've indicated on the right on this grid that I provided, which is essentially no off-site improvements will be required except for any improvements required by the Shelton Municipal Code and other controlling law. And I sort of thought there's no reason we can't just combine those two together, and that's how we ended up with what's in there now. And so what it says now is no off-site improvements will be required except for any improvements required by the Shelton Municipal Code and other controlling law, including but not limited to review under the State Environmental Policy Act or a traffic impact analysis. And there's not a large difference between the two proposals. The only reason that I think the more specific language is helpful is because it identifies a specific interest for the city, which is namely that this project could potentially have an impact on traffic, which I know came up yesterday. And so we just want to identify, so SEPA analysis and traffic impact analysis is something that is typically done in a lot of developments. And so we're not adding any additional requirements under this language. It's just identifying what specific law and what specific review we're anticipating this project having to go through. And I don't know if, Mark, if you can explain a little more about the relationship between SEPA and traffic impact analysis.
Yeah, well, the SEPA is going to look at any impact that a development such as this might have. It's no different than any other commercial development, subdivision, anything like that. So we will ask the applicant to fill out a SEPA checklist, do an analysis of stormwater, traffic, various other issues, environmental issues that might come up as well. So this is common. It's done through our planning and permitting processes, and will actually give us and give staff and give the council an opportunity to review any impacts that might come out of a development. SEPA doesn't necessarily dictate all of the mitigations that might come out of that, but it will give us a sense of what the impacts might be, so we can essentially negotiate some mitigations or require mitigation based on those impacts.
It's also defined within our design standards also. There are quite a few points in here with our design standards that would kick a traffic impact analysis into play. And it goes through 10 different aspects of the development that could kick those into effect and have a traffic impact analysis done.
Is that common in a lease or through the permitting process? Normally, would you see that language in a lease, or would we do SEPA when they apply for the permits?
Well, I think what you're seeing here is trying, normally it would be handled during a submittal, but I think what you're seeing here is trying to exclude that through the lease. So it kind of hits on two different points, and maybe John can add on to that, but really it's done during submittal.
Okay, I'm gonna, steer me if I go wrong. If it's okay with the council, I'd like to go through each one of these points, have staff, and then at least have a discussion with Rob on each point as we go. Is that acceptable to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So is it okay for Rob?
Yeah, absolutely fair.
Okay, go ahead.
Mayor and council members, it's a pleasure to be here again. Big picture is we're going to have a YMCA. It's really cool. Little picture is it's been kind of a brutal day. We were quite surprised at what we got this morning. But we have worked pretty hard, and I can tell you there's almost nothing left. Two of these issues, I'll just tell you right now, the last two are no longer issues. The first insurance provision, we didn't like that because it's not measurable, but okay, we're not going to object. And the last one about no event shall the purchase price be less than actual assessed value, that's our recommendation, and they've accepted that. That's in your lease, so we're only looking at the first two. Now, as to the first one, I have 2 points. One is I agree, as always, 100% with Mr. Ziegler and Mr. Gregory. It's already part of your law. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but last night we said over and over again, throughout this whole thing, we have to comply with codes and laws. And why are we specifying some codes and some laws in addition to complying with codes and laws? That's not what we usually do with leases. We comply with codes and laws. And as the city staff has said, that's part of their deal. It's part of your codes and laws. Second thing is, the way it's typed under current language in this is not accurate. The version that we've been given is B site development plan. And then if you go down the fourth line, it says, except for any improvements required by, and there are two dependent clauses. First one says the Shelton Municipal Code and other controlling law, including but not limited to, review under the SEPA. And then the second one is, or a traffic impact analysis. I send a kid out there with a counter and have him do a traffic impact analysis? No, we'd rather just have it subject to your codes and laws, just like everybody else is. The way this is written, it's like any traffic impact analysis. Now, that's not the biggest deal in the world, so I'm going to leave it alone. You do what you want with it, but we don't think that's fair. Second thing is, oh, I'm sorry. I'll wait for the next topic.
Yeah, let's do one at a time. Is that okay?
I get cranked up, you know,
Okay.
it's hard to stop me.
Okay. I'll ask John to.
Yeah, if I could just respond briefly. Yeah, I mean, I understand Mr. Wilson-Haas's point. The things that are listed are typically done under the review process. However, I think it's important that we do specifically identify which laws and which processes that we're hoping the YMCA will comply with. And the reason that might be important is because if in the future there is resistance to, for example, building an off-site improvement like a turn lane, if we decide later on that they need to build a turn lane, something that could help the city is having specific language in the lease that evinces the intent of the parties to comply with those processes. So even though, I mean, even though Mr. Wilson-Haas is right that these are things that are already required under current law, there's really no harm in specifically listing them to evince the intent of the types of off-site improvements that the city expects it might need. And we don't know if we're going to need those or not, because that's going to require essentially the typical review process that would normally happen for any development. So to respond to YMCA Council, we are treating them just like every other development. We're just making sure that the intent of the parties is clearly and specifically identified in the lease, so that if this becomes a sticking point later, we'll be able to rely on the language.
John, could you clarify one thing?
Yeah.
The discrepancy between what's in the grid and what's actually in the draft document?
Yeah.
Which one is your?
The draft document, the draft document is accurate. This is, this current language in here is not accurate. It should be what's in the contract, yeah. And that's my fault. That's a typo on my part, because I made this after the fact. So I apologize for that.
Okay.
This may be a matter of language or semantics, but is there a reason that it's including but not limited to rather than such as? If we're simply trying to point to the types of things we anticipate will come up?
I think from a legal standpoint, there's not a huge difference between including but not limited to or such as. We just wanted to make sure that these are some specific concerns that the city has identified that it might be interested in, but there are also obviously other laws that are going to be that they're going to be subject to during the review process, and we just wanted to essentially evince the intent of the city that this is something that we're sort of watching as we go through the process.
I'm Rick Haas, and from the time I delivered the first draft of land lease to the city 4 or 5 months ago that I got from the Port of Shelton, their standard land lease, we have always agreed in at least 5 provisions to comply with all codes and laws. When I left the meeting last night, it was clear to me there was strong support from the 6 council members here, and I knew from Mr. Dorsey's last communication he was in support of this, and there was agreement on all of the remaining issues. But when we opened up that document this morning, there were so many surprises and changes that it made me really remember fondly the good faith negotiations we had with prior council. She encouraged us to talk to staff and council members. We're now forbidden to have these things about new ordinances, Shelton Municipal Code Section 2040 and traffic impact studies presented to us this morning after never discussing them just doesn't seem right. The city is completely protected if we're treated like everybody else, and we have to comply with all codes, regulations, and laws.
Thank you, Rick.
I thought we had all this worked out last night as well. I think we should just go ahead and move forward with what we agreed to last night.
I think the issue is that we all walked out of last night thinking we had reached an agreement, and there seemed to be some sticking points in the particular language. My understanding is that all of the council members have expressed that this needs to move forward, and it needs to move forward tonight. So I would hope that we can take each item, let's make a decision, move forward, and get this lease signed, and move on with the project. So at this point, our city council is recommending additional language here where our council members, what feedback do we have about which version needs to be included in the lease?
I'm comfortable leaving it as Shelton Municipal Code and other controlling law being the period at the end of that sentence.
Mr. Mayor, you've been very quiet.
Thank you. John, your interpretation, traffic impact analysis is or is not covered in other controlling laws? you seem to be really concerned to have that specific language in there.
It's not, I mean, here's the advice that I want to give. I don't want to, I think the way that I want to frame this is, the more ambiguous language that is less specific is going to favor a party who might try and essentially resist certain SEPA requirements later on. The more specific language is going to make it more difficult for them to do that. So when the city does go through, the whole review, SEPA process and mitigation and all that is a fairly complicated review. And there's hearings and there's, you can submit letters and there's an appeal process. I mean, it's a fairly complicated process. And the more language we can put in to smooth that process out now is going to help the city later. But it's ultimately up to the city. If the city is comfortable with what the YMCA's provided, then that's fine. But I do think that the more specific language, number one, like I said, it's more specific, which I think is helpful. It doesn't add any additional requirements, but it evinces the intent of the city, so that later on, if there's some resistance, we have essentially legal language to rely on. So that's potentially the risk that this is allocating against. And so it's your job to decide whether that risk is worth it or not to you.
On the other side of that, I would ask YMCA Council, since it seems that we all agree those things are covered, what is the concern with including it in the contract? And edify me if you would.
Well, other than the fact that we've had 24 negotiating sessions and all matters and issues were discussed in detail, and this came as a surprise to us this morning, we don't have a chance to review it. If council is accurate that this adds no additional legal requirement, then there's no point. If the YMCA is going to be treated like everybody else, there must comply with all codes and regulations, and that's what they intend to do. But we don't know what municipal code section 2040 is. We don't know how these traffic impact studies may apply, and it is an additional requirement beyond all codes and regulations from the way council has drafted that language.
I disagree with that analysis. There's nothing in the language that provides that increases the legal requirements on the YMCA. All it does is clarify the intent of the parties. Furthermore, I would say that YMCA council and myself and city staff had a negotiation session before the meeting yesterday where we did talk about this specific issue about offsite improvements and what that meant, and we did talk about how something like a traffic analysis might indicate that the YMCA might need to build an offsite improvement like something like a turn lane. And we wanted to clarify the contract to make sure that and YMCA indicated to us that they wanted to comply with everything. And so we just wanted to clarify the contract to demonstrate that intent, to say that, okay, well, regarding offsite improvements, if our SEPA analysis shows that there's going to be a big traffic impact and we want to put in a turn lane, we want to make sure that the contract captures the intent of the parties regarding that issue. And I do not agree that the language adds any additional legal requirements. It just clarifies the legal requirements that are already there, such that it reflects the discussions that we've had. But as I said, I mean, if the council is more comfortable with the version presented by the YMCA, then that's what we should go with. I think I've said pretty much everything regarding the risk that I think the city can avoid, and it's your to decide whether that risk is worth it to you.
Well, do we have consensus? I assume we'll have consensus on what clause to put in the contract and then vote on the contract. So we have consensus on that.
Yes.
On which version, the YMCA?
The
The YMCA, I've heard more yeses. I'm going to state that I'd probably side with our city council since we're representing the city. And that's not saying I'm going to vote the lease down if the other clause gets in, but that, on this clause, I would go with the city. Any other?
I'm perfectly comfortable with the Y's proposal
Okay.
at this point.
Okay, so we have a consensus with the Y language, okay?
So just, also just, I should have said this earlier. So I have this document on my computer right now, and my plan is to, as the council makes decisions regarding language, I'm updating it like live. So at the end, we'll have an accurate contract.
All right,
But yeah, I will note that, so the council has a consensus on the YMCA proposal.
okay. Thank you. So now on to the second grid.
So the second issue is the parking provision, which appears on page 4.
Second and last.
Second and final.
Yeah, second and
Final.
last. Page 4.
Just want to make it clear.
2C. And this is something that we discussed at length yesterday. And it was my understanding that the council's intent was that the YMCA would be required to build whatever number of parking spaces that the code would require them to build. In addition to that, they would provide an unimproved space that would be big enough for 20 additional spaces. So they wouldn't pave it, but they would just provide just a chunk of land that would be unimproved that the city could then later, if they decided one additional parking, could pave it. And then if there were other shared parking agreements, that would essentially be separate. I don't recall any discussion yesterday that shared parking agreements would potentially satisfy the YMCA's obligation to reserve unimproved space for additional spaces. However, when I sent that language to YMCA Council today, they indicated that it was their understanding that the potentially shared parking agreements, which they don't have yet, but they intend to get with the school district, would somehow satisfy the requirement to provide an additional space for 20 spaces. And I essentially indicated to them that that seemed contrary to what the council had decided last night. So I did not change it. I did, however, incorporate reference to the municipal code provision. So if you look at the code, so the version that I sent you this morning, it basically said, it starts on page 4, but then it goes on to page 5. However, any shared parking agreement involving the lessee will not be interpreted as reducing the number of spaces lessee is required to construct under the Shelton Municipal Code and project approval stipulations. And the one I sent you this morning, it just ended there. But then later I added on this final clause that basically said, unless the lessor specifically permits a shared parking agreement to do so under Shelton Municipal Code 2040. Shelton Municipal Code 2040 is a code provision that specifically governs shared parking agreements. And it provides a series of elements that someone who is seeking a shared parking agreement to satisfy before that agreement can essentially relieve other obligations under the code. So essentially that change brings the contract, kind of makes it jive with the code a little bit better, just because it recognizes that, because council pointed out to me that the code does allow shared parking agreements under certain circumstances. And so that addition sort of marries the two ideas where what we want to emphasize here is YMCA is going to be required to build whatever number of spots they're required to build, and then they're also going to provide this unimproved space. A shared parking agreement isn't going to be interpreted to mitigate those responsibilities unless the city decides that it will under that separate code provision. And those code provisions essentially provide the process and the considerations for how that would be determined. But as I said, I think this language encapsulates what the council agreed to last night. And then YMCA Council today told me that they didn't agree essentially. And so I kept the language the same, but included that reference to section 2040 to account for the city's procedure under the code for shared parking agreements.
And I know the answer, I think. That's the same procedure that two businesses would have if they were trying to propose to share a parking lot.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I thought we had a clear discussion and understanding about it. And this morning, I read the lease that says, unless the lessor specifically permits a shared parking agreement to do so under Shelton Municipal Code 2040. This is just a surprise to us. It isn't at all what we discussed. And it is, it doesn't solve the problem. There are two provisions in this lease about fully cooperating. We all know that we need to have adequate parking. The Y has offered to provide, to completely comply with code, number one, and to provide additional space, number two. And we all discussed it, and I thought came to a resolution. So adding this new provision, it's a surprise, and it's a change, and we don't like it.
I listened very carefully last night because I was ready to pop up if this came up. But what I heard last night was that we don't have an agreement yet, so we can't say we have an agreement yet, so we can't rely on that agreement. But I gotta tell you, this is kind of silly to me. Because if we do get an agreement with the city of Shelton for that parking lot right next to us, guess what? You get a whole lot more than 20 spaces, and you don't have to pay for the paving. So all we want to do is say, look, a couple of options here. One is, we'll reserve an area, 20 spaces. Or, if it works out with the city of Shelton, or with the Shelton School District, then that'll be even a better deal for you guys. If you don't want it, okay. But it just seems silly.
So I'm a little confused on the disagreement. Is it the 20 stalls, or is it complying with Shelton Municipal Code for required parking for that facility on its own?
It's the Shelton, the new reference to Shelton Municipal Code.
My question,
We've agreed to comply with all laws and codes. Why this one?
So here was my understanding of the disagreement earlier today, and maybe YMCA Council can explain further. If you look at the line that's in blue, that says, unless the lessor specifically permits a shared parking agreement to do so under Shelton Municipal Code 2040. That did not appear in the version of the contract that I sent them this morning. That was something that I added before this meeting after further discussion with YMCA Council today. So just for a minute, just so we can sort of walk through this, ignore that blue sentence. Just pretend it's not there. Let's go back to the contract that I sent them this morning. It was my understanding from the council last night that what the council wants is they need to build all the spaces required under the code. They need to reserve this space for 20 additional spaces. They might get another shared parking agreement, but it was my understanding from the council that any additional shared parking agreement wouldn't alleviate their burden to reserve that spot for 20 additional spaces. What YMCA Council told me today was that it was their understanding that a shared parking agreement would essentially count as the 20 additional spaces that we had asked them to reserve for us in the city. And that was the part that I do not think the council expressed last night, under my recollection.
My recollection was they were gonna have 150 parking spaces and reserve an area for 20 more down the road if we needed them. That's.
Exactly.
But what this does, our agreement yesterday was that we comply with the code. And the code in Shelton allows for shared parking, right? Any of you who have a business, you can reach an agreement with adjoining property owner who has available parking. But there's this new sentence that says, however, any shared parking agreement involving the lessee will not be interpreted as reducing the number of spaces lessee is required to construct. So why are we being treated differently than everyone else?
If I could respond, they're not being treated differently. And this is actually something that, when Rick pointed out to me today, that's actually why I added the provision before the meeting tonight. Because Rick pointed out, and he's correct, there's a provision in the municipal code that permits shared parking agreements. And it says that if you have a shared parking agreement, sometimes those agreements, under certain circumstances, can reduce the number of spaces that you might otherwise be required to build. And so that's why I added the provision at the end. Because the whole purpose of this is I wanted to address Rick's contention that a shared parking agreement would alleviate the YMCA's responsibility to reserve an unimproved space for 20 lots. That, in my view, is not what the council expressed last night. However, the code does permit a shared parking agreement to mitigate the spaces they'd otherwise be required to build under the code under certain circumstances. And so that's why that sentence, it says, however, any shared parking agreement involving the lessee will not be interpreted as reducing the number of spaces lessees required to construct under the Shelton Municipal Code and project approval stipulations unless the lessor specifically permits a shared parking agreement to do so under Shelton Municipal Code, which is the typical process. So they're being treated just like everybody else. It's basically saying if they qualify under the specific code for shared parking agreements, then we would grant that exception just like anybody else.
John, if I may,
Yeah.
how is that different than the first sentence of section 4 that says that they're required to do so under Shelton Municipal Code? Are you just wanting to specify the language? Because my understanding would be those two are the same.
I think the reason it's there is because we've asked for specific kind of, one reason that it's there is because we've asked them to reserve a spot for other parking spaces, and that's kind of a unique circumstance. And so I think it's important that we essentially clarify in that part of the contract that reserved space for 20 lots, for 20 spaces that's unimproved, is seen separate.
That was an excellent question, but let's just go through the first 3 sentences of section 2C4. Number 1, lessee shall construct the number of parking spaces required by the Shelton Municipal Code and project approval stipulations. We'll comply with the code. That's what we've agreed to from day 1. Number 2, lessee, and this wasn't required by the city, this was offered by the YMCA because we learned of your difficulty with the huff and puff, maybe losing that parking area. We offered, in addition, lessee will provide an unimproved area sufficient for at least 20 more parking spaces than required by the Shelton Municipal Code. And number 3, the parties will cooperate in good faith to address the parking needs of nearby facilities, including Oakland Bay Junior High, the Huff and Puff, and disc golf. These other sentences reduce the freedom of the YMCA to comply with your codes. We have imposed new restrictions. That hasn't ever been the deal.
Thank you, Rick.
I disagree that this language does impose new restrictions in the sense that we've asked them to provide an unimproved space for 20 lots. That's not something that would typically be required under the code. That is something that we're requiring under the contract in exchange for the land that we're leasing to them. So that would be the additional requirement. And the other language in there is to make sure that any shared agreement doesn't essentially cut back on what we've already asked them to give us.
Okay, that's the concern. So I understand where that's coming from, but I'm comfortable moving this forward as our original discussion from last night, where we ended up, so.
Yeah.
Which is that basically the additional language, I don't see why that just seems, at this juncture, doesn't seem to be necessary.
We
so.
agreed last night on it.
Council membership, are you saying that we would, after and disc golf period, that would be the end of section 4? And we would eliminate
Yeah.
following language?
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
Yep. We discussed this last night and came to a consensus. And I think that we, as a city and council, we need to keep our word to you. Yes.
Okay, so that language is what we're going to consensus on? Okay. John, did you catch that?
So if I understand correctly, the council wants to essentially delete the sentence beginning with the word however.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Okay, I will note that.
So with that being done, those two changes,
So, yeah, with that being done, there are no remaining disagreements. If the council would like, I'm happy to walk through the other changes that we made in agreement with council today, just so that you're aware of the other changes, if you think that would be helpful. There aren't a ton.
I would like that if we're going to approve
Okay.
the lease tonight.
Yes.
And I've just seen this version, I haven't even read it yet, so to say that there are no other disagreements, we're going to reserve judgment on that.
And John, would these be the changes since we were emailed this morning, or is
Yes,
this
so,
since
so,
last
so,
night's?
so after I emailed council this morning, I met with city staff and discussed some of the proposals that we received from YMCA council. And YMCA council and I were able to come to a compromise on a number of those, and some of these changes essentially embody those compromises.
Thank you.
So I think we can start on page 2. So I'll skip over the other controlling law bit since we already talked quite a bit about that. So one change is we deleted this sentence regarding the stormwater facilities that says the city will retain full control and discretion regarding the city's existing stormwater facilities on the premises. The YMCA will not use or otherwise interfere with the city's use of the stormwater facilities absent the express written authorization of the city. This was more a discussion about specific language rather than substantive legal requirements. I think the YMCA and the city are pretty much in agreement that there are stormwater facilities on the premises, and YMCA has represented that the city and the YMCA are pretty much in agreement that those are the city's facilities and the city has control of them, and the YMCA is not going to interfere with them, except for there is a provision in here that basically says if the city determines that the YMCA can use those storm facilities without, burdening the city's needs, then the city can allow them to do that. There is a separate provision in the contract that requires the YMCA to construct and maintain their own storm facilities. So I'm not expecting storm facilities to be a major sticking point. But like I said, I think this was more or less in the same place, just sort of settling on what the change was to have. So we deleted that provision. Are there any questions about that?
Rick, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I don't like any of this top of page 3, paragraph 1B. The site development plan says the city can have input into the YMCA. No off-site improvements will be required. The city and the YMCA will cooperate in good faith regarding shared parking, stormwater facilities, so on. Why do we need this? There's a stormwater facility there. We have to comply with permit requirements. We have to get permits. We have to comply with code. If there's excess capacity, the city will allow us to use it. If there isn't, the city won't allow us to use it, and we'll construct our own. But, and what is this? If the city decides that they're not satisfied with our operations and we don't offer a sufficient level of service reasonable to the city's contributions, then they can claim there's a default by the Y and there's a breach of the agreement. This is not necessary. It doesn't belong in a lease.
So the striking of this sentence, as it is in the lease currently, has been agreed to by council on both sides, is that correct?
Yes.
Well, I asked for striking the whole paragraph. One sentence is stricken.
Thank you.
So to provide some context, in an earlier draft, they had stricken most of that paragraph. I responded with another draft with a lot of the language put back in, and we changed parts of it. And then in the subsequent draft, they indicated that was acceptable. So if that's not the case now, then that's potentially a remaining issue. But that language was in an earlier draft, and they didn't object.
Well, I've never accepted this language. So why don't we just take it sentence by sentence? Top of page 3, in the event the site design and engineering analysis conclude that the city's stormwater facility on the premise has the capacity to serve certain YMCA project stormwater needs, and if the city finds the YMCA's use of the existing stormwater facility comports with city needs, the city will cooperate. Well, don't we have a sentence earlier that says the city and YMCA will cooperate in stormwater facilities? So there are quite a few qualifications there. Why don't we just cooperate? I've driven by that stormwater facility about 4 times a day for the last 30 or so years, and I've never seen a drop of water in it. But we want to comply with code. The next sentence says, the fundamental basis for this lease agreement is that the city and city residents will receive benefits at a level that is reasonable in light of the city's provision of the premise for this project, which value at the time of execution shall be the appraised value. Well, the first information I got from the city of Shelton, from, I'm not sure your economic development fellow's name, but he sent me a copy of the Sammamish City lease. He says, this is what we want to see. This is $1 a year lease. I said, fantastic. The city of Sammamish built a building and leased it to the Y for $1 a year. Oh no, that's not quite what we want.
But in case we want to do that.
A fundamental basis is that the city will receive benefits at a level that is reasonable in light of the city's provisions of this lease. We're out there trying to raise $15 or $16 million. The assessed value of this land's about $150,000. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful contribution. It's a perfect spot. It meets our needs. But why in the world do you want to sit in judgment over how the Y is running 5 years or 10 years or 20 years from now and say, you aren't meeting our needs, so we're going to claim you're in breach of the agreement? Why do you need that?
So to move this forward, you want that whole paragraph struck.
It has no
That-
reason
that-
to exist.
That's
in
option
this
B, and option A is
As presented.
as presented.
I was under the understanding that if we needed more of the stormwater, that the YMCA would pitch in and do the up.
Absolutely.
That's what I understood.
The YMCA is going to do 2 things. They're going to comply with all codes, and they're going to cooperate in good faith.
Right, and so I'm a little confused at this, that we aren't going with, okay, where the stormwater is, and when the YMCA needs to step up and do their part, they'll do it.
That's going to be in our permit requirements,
Right.
isn't it?
Yeah, I'd like to know why we're even discussing that. That was an understanding. Maybe I'm wrong.
And I believe that was the understanding. I think the contention is that clearly outlined in the 4 corners of the lease. And that's where there seems to be a bone of contention.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I'm not clear. I'm not clear what the disagreement is. So as I mentioned, this language was in a version of the lease that I sent out this morning, and when council responded with their objections, they didn't object to this language. So I don't have a potential compromise on this issue. I thought this language was agreed to, which is why I'm not sure how to address the disagreement that we're having currently. I do think that at the very least, the sentence at the top, in the event that the site design and engineering laws conclude that the city's existing stormwater facility on the premises has the capacity to serve certain YMCA project stormwater needs, and if the city finds that the YMCA's use of the existing stormwater facility on the premises comports with city needs, the city will cooperate in good faith with the YMCA toward that end. That's essentially the provision that we had discussed on Monday, that the city is not objecting to, and I don't believe the YMCA is objecting to, which basically says that if the city decides that the YMCA can use its stormwater facilities, then it can. The remainder of this paragraph, I think, just encapsulates the underlying purpose of the agreement, which is that we're giving the YMCA a chunk of land, and we want to make sure that we're getting value in exchange for that.
I heard your economic development consultant say that this Y is going to be a catalyst for future economic development in Shelton. I heard the EDC say that this YMCA is going to create an economic boon in Mason County and Shelton. We're going to address the 30% of Shelton kids in poverty, the 40% of Shelton Hispanic kids in poverty, the 50% of Native American kids in poverty. We're giving plenty of value to this community. Why in the world would the city council want to sit in judgment whether we're giving enough value? I'm not sure why you'd even want that.
It just needs to be really clear in the lease contract that if needed more stormwater, the YMCA steps in. Yeah, right.
In several places.
And I-
Rules and regulations, section E on page 3, Leslie will comply with all city of Shelton ordinances regarding the development, construction, use, and care of the premises.
Yep.
But there's 4 or 5 other provisions that say that have the same legal effect.
So,
Go ahead,
correct me
Deidre.
if I'm wrong, but I seem to have heard somewhat of a compromise in there, that if we were to end after the city will cooperate in good faith with the YMCA towards that end and delete the remainder of the paragraph, that both councils feel comfortable with that language. Is that the case?
Well, I think the city should decide whether it wants to keep that language in or not. I don't know how thoroughly you've read through.
Very thoroughly.
That's the case. And I say we move with that.
The YMCA would agree with that compromise.
Yeah, and I would concur.
Yep.
And just a point of clarification, the assessed value of the estimated value of the property at the time of the surplus was around $320,000. So that is
Plus.
plus, that's the bare land
Yeah.
That's the
value.
bare land value.
Yep.
Noted.
Well, there's a phrase and there's assess.
Understood.
Yeah.
To John, any more changes?
Well, I mean, part of this, my understanding was to get the benefit in here to justify the lease.
Yeah, and I think if I.
And is it, I don't have this memorized, I've read it enough, but I don't have it memorized. Is there other places where in the lease, it states the public benefit to justify the city doing this? I mean, that's part of the issue also, is it not?
Yeah, and I think you've sort of touched on why this language is sort of in there in the first place. Obviously, everyone's very excited about the prospect of having a YMCA in Shelton. It's understandable why, that can be such a boon to this community. At the same time, though, this is city land, and we should be mindful of, to the extent to which the city wants to be able to have a say in how the YMCA is being run. This is a really long lease. This lease could potentially be 100 years long. And so if you think it's in the realm of possibility, which I think it is, the realm of possibility that maybe the YMCA makes some decisions later on in how they're using the property that the city might not agree with. It's helpful to have provisions like this, where the city can basically say, we might want to mediate whether this use is consistent with the public benefit that we intended when we first drafted this agreement. And I can provide you an example. I mean, so for example, there's a sublease provision later in the contract that lets the YMCA lease parts of their building out to different entities to use it. And maybe that'll be the school district, maybe that'll be the hospital, but 20 years down the road, I mean, who knows what they could be using the subleases for? Maybe the other thing to consider too is if they're leasing the entire building to all of these different entities like the hospital and the school and the college, those are certainly worthy pursuits, but it makes you wonder why those services aren't being held on those campuses and the YMCA space isn't being used for other community purposes, and yet the YMCA is making money from subleasing it. But again, this is ultimately a policy decision, and if you're comfortable striking that language because you think the YMCA is essentially always going to run the property in a way that you think is commendable and in a way that is in the spirit of the YMCA's mission, then I think it's totally fine. Again, like I said, it's all about whether or not you think the risk is worth it. The potential risk of removing this language is that if sometime down the line, the YMCA starts operating the facility in the way that some future council might think is contrary to the city's interests. And if that's the case, then that language provides a potential remedy. And I understand that, there's clearly no indication now that would ever happen. But I think I said something like this yesterday. When people are drafting contracts, they never think that bad things are going to happen. And so the council needs to decide whether the risk is worth it to you.
So are we down to number D, use of premises? Okay.
We're still up.
We're still up
We're
If
there?
I may just focus,
Okay.
look at the first page, recitals. That is the public benefit provision. I did about 30 hours of research, read every single public benefit case there is several times, gave Kristen French about a 20-page memorandum. That's where you got your information from, was my research. I know what public benefit law is. And this was crafted to include enough language so that you're clearly covered in terms of public benefit. There are no issues here. And then if you look at C on page 2, YMCA programs, it is a provision of this lease already. So all that talk, look at C.
So what's the consensus of the group? Strike basically the last 2/3 of that paragraph, paragraph B.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or like basically half of paragraph B. From A benefits at a level to the end would be struck.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Catch that, John?
Yeah, I got
I
it.
know.
My computer died though, so I'll have to make the changes a little bit later. But that's fine. Yeah, I got that change. So we'll cut the part, we'll cut the portion after it says a
What?
fundamental basis, essentially to the end of that paragraph. So moving sort of quickly through to the next change, we already discussed the parking provision. If you flip to page 6, and again, just to circle back to what we'd started, the rest of these changes, as I indicated, are things that I've already discussed with YMCA Council and that we came to an agreement regarding. So I don't expect that there will be many remaining issues on this. But if you go to page 6, under D, we changed the termination provision from a 2 years written notice to 5 years written notice. And that was just consistent with the discussion that we had last night, if you recall, talking about extending the 2 years to 5 years. We also added, further down the paragraph, it basically says, if lessee fails to pay such charges, this is charges if they if the lease terminates and they fail to remove fixtures and equipment and that sort of thing, we can charge them for basically failing to remove those things. And this says that if lessee fails to pay such charges within 60 days after notice of charges, then lessor may elect to sell such property according to lessor's policies and state law. And we just added the and state law provision, since we would have to comply with state law anyway.
And that's after 5 years?
That would be after 5 years, yeah.
Okay.
Council has forgotten my strenuous objection to the term lessor's policies. Having drafted several hundred municipal leases myself, I am aware that lessor can adopt policies from time to time. That gives no comfort to a lessee. State law gives comfort. We strongly request the striking of the words according to lessor's policies. If it's according to state law, perfect. That's all we ask for.
Okay.
John, any response?
I mean, the city has to comply with its policies. I mean, the city has codes, the city has policies for running itself. I don't see why we should make an exception for the YMCA. The YMCA all night has been asking to be treated like everybody else, and everybody else is going to be subject to the city's policies. So I don't understand why we should make an exception under this contract.
And I would like to commend council last night for helping us come to the idea of a 5-year. We had a bit of a struggle about whether there should be maintenance involved, what would happen should the lease terminate, and I appreciate helping us get to that common ground in the middle. I think the fact that we're down to just this small bit is a testament to the hard work done on the part of both parties, so thank you.
So I heard that has to be changed on one side and strongly not changed on the other side, so.
All we ask is require we comply with the law.
The contract expressly does that.
The city policies within the city are. Okay.
And John, is this consistent with other leases that the city holds? Our typical language is to require according to lessor's policies and state law. Is that correct?
I don't know about this city's, I don't know about this city's agreement specifically, but I can say that other cities I've worked with have language similar to this in various agreements. It's not uncommon.
Think what you're talking about. The equipment from YMCA. What if there's a dispute between the YMCA, or they go out of business, they can't find a buyer, and you want to sell the equipment? And you adopt a policy that says, we're going to sell this equipment to the first person who comes with $10,000 in cash. That's your policy. Maybe it's a legal policy, but it doesn't give the YMCA any protection. All we want is to be protected by state law.
City policies already have to comply with state law, so it doesn't really make sense to imagine some hypothetical where the city will adopt some wild policy and try to sell equipment under that policy.
Because we have to, as a city, have to abide by that state.
Absolutely. Yeah,
state
we
law.
can't draft
Can't
any.
do what we want.
The city is not allowed to draft ordinances or policies or codes that are contrary to state law.
Consensus of the group. Leave lesser policies in or strike it?
On behalf of the YMCA, leave it in. It's not going to kill anybody. Policies have to comply with state law. Let's just get this over with.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you, Rob.
thank you.
Okay, the next change that we implemented appears on page 10. And this has to do with the provision that we spoke about last night. This is a small change that I don't think really changes the meaning of the contract in a huge way. But this has to do with, last night we engaged in this large discussion regarding what happens to the building if the lease terminates. And we originally had this language saying that the city basically gets to decide whether to keep it if they want or whether to require the YMCA to tear it down. So in that provision, originally it read, in the event of termination of this lease agreement, this is under 6B under remedies. In the event of termination of this lease agreement, lessor and lessor's sole discretion may at the time of termination require lessee to remove all structural or site improvements and return the premises to a condition equivalent to that initiation of the lease, or in lessor's sole discretion may allow structural and site improvements to remain on the premises with such improvements to become lessor's property free and clear of any encumbrances or claims. And that was a provision that the council specifically said they wanted to include, and as a compromise, we extended, as Councilwoman Peterson mentioned, we extended the termination notice out to 5 years. There was an issue that came up today regarding the word sole discretion, and I sort of chatted with council about whether it should be sole discretion or reasonable discretion. And then after looking at it, I sort of thought, like, well, we actually could just delete that whole clause altogether, and I think it makes it, you sort of just avoid the issue. And so now, and YMCA council indicated that that was acceptable to them. So we've deleted that clause. So now it just says, in the event of termination of the lease, lessor may, at the time of termination, require lessee, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So it fundamentally keeps the same meaning and just kind of eliminates that discretion language. The next change, I'll skip to, the next change is basically the same, because the same language appears again on the next page, on page 11, under G. And so we, just to keep it consistent, removed that same clause.
Good.
So if there are no questions, I'll move on to the next one. So the next is the purchase price, which council indicated at the beginning of the meeting they were satisfied with. There was a little bit of a confusion regarding whether we were dealing with assessed value or appraised value. And so YMCA Council pointed that out to me today, and we just decided to revert to the language that said the assessed value. So in the event that the YMCA elects to purchase it, they will it will be purchased for the then assessed value, but it won't be lower than the assessed value at the time of execution, which I believe would be the number that you mentioned earlier, the 300 and whatever number. So that would essentially be the floor under that provision.
And no object, that's good
Yeah.
with all parties? Okay, thank you.
The next change appears on page 12, and this was a recommended change from YMCA Council, the assignment or sublease under subsection 9D. And this is, again, something that the council discussed yesterday. When we started talking about what happens to the building, we started talking about, well, what type of entity do we want to let them give the building to if the YMCA for some reason has to terminate the lease and leave town? And the council indicated that they wanted to basically make sure that the YMCA either transferred the building to another not-for-profit entity, or if they transferred it to a for-profit entity, the city would retain the right to basically renegotiate the lease. And so we put that language in, but as YMCA Council pointed out, it was a little bit ambiguous, and it could have been read to apply to subleases, which we didn't really intend it to do. And so to make it more clear that it doesn't apply to subleases, that it really only applies when we're talking about transferring like the whole building or a substantial part of the building. And so we inserted this language here that says, this is kind of halfway through the paragraph. Subject to the lessor's written consent, lessee may assign or transfer all or substantially all the facilities subject to this lease to a not-for-profit entity under the terms of this agreement. And then to make it consistent, put it in the second sentence as well. Subject to the lessor's written consent, lessee may assign or transfer all substantially all the facilities subject to this lease to a for-profit entity. However, the lessor shall renegotiate the terms of this agreement with the for-profit assignee. And so all we did was add that all or substantially all language, just to clarify that when we're talking about transferring interests in the building, we're not talking about transferring a small interest like a sublease. We're talking about transferring like a big interest.
The whole building.
Yeah, because that was, and I think that's consistent with what the council discussed yesterday. Yeah, so hopefully I've fairly characterized that for YMCA Council. Anything else to add to that?
So if there's a juice bar in the YMCA and something happens to the this juice bar can't stay there and sublease that space. The whole building has to be taken over by someone.
Well, so this essentially has to do with if for some reason the YMCA decides to assign their interest in the contract, which could be, I mean, it's tough to think of a reason why, but who knows? Something terrible happens and the YMCA decides that they need to leave. So one way that the YMCA can protect themselves from not having to tear the building down, for example, like because that's in the contract too, is by finding an assignee to basically take over operating the building. And if they can't find, let's say they can't find a not-for-profit, and let's say instead they find, I don't know, like a 24-hour fitness or something, like a for-profit agency. Well, the city is kind of in a bind, right? Because the whole idea was we were going to give this land for public use. And if we're just going to give the land over to operation of like a big company, then we want to be able to renegotiate the terms of the lease.
Right.
And basically say like, okay, well, if you're going to take it, then that changes the game, and we want to go back to step one and kind of figure out how operation of this facility would work.
A profit business, it would have to come down to, they would have to buy the property and the building.
That's something we could negotiate, obviously.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, that's the final change to the contract?
I believe so,
Doesn't
yes.
look like anything else is there.
Thank you for your patience. I just have one word that stands between the legacy of this council, generations of happy screaming kids, and a signed deal. Anybody ever missed a payment? Ever miss a payment by accident?
Water.
Bookkeeper missed it? Yeah. There's been a change, and I just picked it up, but if the Y misses an insurance payment for 30 days, you can default the lease. I just ask you on page 9 in section S to change the 30 business days to 60 business days. And I really want to thank you for your patience and your cooperation. For
For you, you get to sit back and relax. For us, now the heavy lifting really starts. So if you would like to join us in making a philanthropic grant for your grandchildren's benefit, please give us a call. Thank you very much.
John, do you have any discussion point on that request?
I don't, other than I believe that it was already changed from, I think before it was actually 5 business days, and it was changed to 30 days, if I'm recalling correctly.
Is there any concern with extending that?
Um,
Does it expose us to any additional risk? Is there any worry there?
Let me just read this provision here.
Well, most insurance, you have so many days and then you have to reapply for insurance, right?
I mean, it just, obviously, if they haven't made their insurance payment in 30 days, you're just essentially doubling the risk if they haven't paid it in 60 days. And so, again, like I said, it's just sort of whether that risk was worth it. Obviously, if they haven't paid their insurance payments, and that affects their insurance coverage.
Is
then-
that a reason why you want to change it to 60?
In my practice, I've experienced dozens of occasions where bookkeepers miss a bill one time, business owners miss paying a bill one time, things get missed by a month. And declare a 100-year lease in default because the payment got missed by a month seems a little aggressive
Yeah.
for this situation.
I mean, I also want to point out, are we talking about subsection S? Failure to maintain insurance?
Actually, no, it's under number 5B.
Oh, okay. I was looking at the wrong provision.
5B.
What page?
I was looking at,
Page 9, 5B, is that correct?
Lesser provided
That's
residence.
rent.
So I want to point out,
Is that rent?
the 30 days,
Rent.
so I want to point out
5B.
that the 30 days isn't 30 days from missing the payment, it's 30 days from when the city provides notice. Does that make sense? Read that provision. Lessee fails to pay any installment of the rent. Are we talking about the rent or
Yes,
the?
We're talking about the rent, and so there's no.
No, we're
we're
not.
talking about insurance.
So the
Page
insurance
9,
is,
paragraph S, failure to maintain
Okay,
insurance.
that's what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
But that's the same issue. It's not 30 days from failure to pay, it's 30 days from when the city provides notice, which is, in my view, a big difference. Failure on the part of the lessee to maintain the insurance as required shall constitute a material breach of this lease, upon which the city of Shelton may, after giving 30 business days written notice to the lessee to correct the breach, terminate the lease, or at its discretion, procure or renew such insurance and pay any and all premiums in connection therewith. So in my view, I don't understand why the city would change that, because basically the way that provision works is, at some point, the city discovers, oh no, they've missed an insurance payment, we better put them on notice. Then we give them notice, you've missed this payment, you need to correct it.
I think that's
And
reasonable.
you have 30 days to correct it.
So that
And then if they fail to correct it in 30 days, then there's that option under the contract.
100.
So really, it's what you think is reasonable. Is it reasonable for a company like the YMCA to correct a payment like that after 30 days' notice?
Yes.
If you think that it's necessary to provide them longer than that, then that's certainly up to you. But yeah, that provision isn't 30 days from payment, it's 30 days from notice.
Okay.
Okay.
Leave as is.
No, yes, we good?
Well, I think so.
We're going to keep that
Um,
that
John-
way it is.
If there,
John got all the changes.
if there are no remaining issues, I think we're ready to get this across the finish line.
So we actually make a motion for something we do not have.
Let's see.
I move to approve the land lease agreement with South Sound YMCA.
Oh,
Oh,
Public comment.
public comment, please. Sorry about that.
I agree, you can make the motion.
My name's Eric Irwin, and I have to say I'm not an attorney, so I've listened to this evening, and I will be honest, it seems as though things are being rushed. And to say, I've heard I agree, and then many disagreements expressed over words, and that is wordsmithing is critical. And so this seems to me to be reminiscent of Nancy Pelosi's statement, you have to pass the bill to read what's in the bill. And that is a concern to me. Additionally, I've reached out to members of local government, members of the YMCA, to have some questions answered, and there are some really fundamental questions that remain. So stepping back from the details of the legal contract and more of the 30,000-foot view, I would like to have at least a few questions on record. One is a question of scale. For a city of 10,000 with the level of people with the level of debt indebtedness that it has, is supporting and initiating a project with a $15 million building and a $1.6 million per year annual budget, the appropriate scale for the community. I've heard that it will cause growth in the community. Yet when I ask members of the YMCA to give me cases of where it resulted in demonstrable and proven growth within a community, none could be provided, or none were provided. When I look at the annual operating budget, $1.6 million, 10% of that is said to be coming from local philanthropy. It's $160,000. That's a lot of money, let's face it. And when I talk with some of the service organizations in the community, many of them, or I shouldn't say many, a president-elect of one has indicated that that $160,000 would be more than 10 times the amount that their organization raised for contributions in the local community last year. Is this going to be a drain on local philanthropy that's going to take care of veterans, that's going to help the homeless, that's going to feed the hungry children in our community? Because that will be in perpetuity, that 10%, unless assuming that it doesn't go away. And that's a bit of a ridiculous statement, but that is assuming that the proposed budgetary needs don't change or will only go up. The reason to suspect that there would be less of a need for philanthropy would seem to be optimistic. If the operating budget isn't met, what are going to be the shortfalls? I hear that there are various safeguards put in, but in the back of my mind and heart of hearts, this sounds like the potential for what is essentially another government-sponsored program within the community, and taking it away from the community once it's in place would be a very unpopular and problematic process. So I don't see that the scale has been addressed, and I don't see that there's been a clear benefit of economic growth that has been demonstrated in any of the conversations that I've had with people locally, and this is a concern to me. There's the potential taking away of local business resource or revenues that are from tax-paying businesses. These are all things that could impact the hospitals providing of services, that could impact other local organizations, and this seems to be a concern. And when I've asked questions about it, the response I've typically received is that that hadn't been a major consideration in the planning. So I would like to ask that the City Council, one, have a chance to look at the contract in its entirety before voting on that, rather than a marked up copy, but also that they step back at a moment and just say, is embarking on a project that has this type of potential long-term financial requirements of resources from the community, and if it falls short, we know the community will come to the City Council for these resources. Has that been factored into the decision making, so that we know that we won't, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we won't be having a request in good faith at that time? I'm not saying there's any malfeasance, but that they wouldn't come back and say, we need to have this supported to keep this facility in your community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Rob Wilson Haas.
Joe.
Are we done?
Come on.
Lisa Woodard.
We need to keep it to extend.
Point of order, at this time, I would move to extend our regular meeting time by 1 hour.
Thank you, Deidre. Moving in second to extend our regular meeting time an hour. So,
I will second it.
okay. Favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Okay. Thank you, Deidre.
My name is Lisa Woodard, and I live in Mason County, and I have the privilege of working in Shelton. I also am raising a son who happens to be in the Shelton School District, and I noticed early on the gap of services, and had the situation of having to drive my son to Olympia and back every day throughout the entire summer. That's 2 trips to Olympia and home, just so he could have something to do for the summertime, where he would be engaged with other teens, with older children that were a good role model, doing sports and other activities. So being a working mom and being a citizen of this community that I feel very passionately about, I really want to thank you for all of your time. I know all of you are significantly passionate about this community, and I really appreciate all of your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary Gibbons.
Council members, Mayor, I'm Mary Gibbons, and I am a family physician, and in that way I'm an advocate for youth and families. And I'm also the wife of Jim Gibbons, and we have a shellfish company here in town, Seattle Shellfish. And our employee base is Shelton. And we've seen firsthand some of the struggles that families and children have in this community. And I've been lucky to be involved with the YMCA over in the Olympia area and see the just incredible way that a YMCA can provide not just the things that the facility provides, but the philanthropic activities such as before and after childcare, before and after school childcare, and some other enhancing activities. And so I'm so impressed with the time and care that you all have put into considering this potential contribution to having that come to your community, to our community. And I just want to thank you for the consideration of bringing this hopefully wonderful thing to your community.
Thanks, Mary.
Jim Morrell.
Good evening. As I was sitting there listening, I woke up this morning to CBS News, and the 12 boys and their coach were freed from the cave in Thailand. And I look forward to the headlines on Thursday morning in the Shelton Mason Journal about the successful passage of the lease agreement with the YMCA. My name is Jim Morrell. I'm CEO for Peninsula Credit Union, 521 West Railroad. And I wanted to actually share a different story with you, a story of a little boy in the 1970s and 80s who went to Little Pilgrim's preschool. He went up a whole lot of flights of stairs to a gymnasium that was part of a YMCA. Over the course of time, that little boy spent time in what was called Indian Guides. It's now, I think, called Adventure Guides. Spending time with his dad racing Pinewood Derby cars, which was just exhilarating experience. He went through swim lessons. He became an eel, a starfish, a pollywog, a guppy, all the way up to a fish, swimming in a YMCA pool. He played floor hockey. He played baseball. He didn't like soccer very much, and he loved basketball. In fact, he loved basketball so much that in 9th grade, he put a whistle around his neck and for 3 years refereed YBA basketball in that same gym that he was in when he was in preschool. That career officiating basketball over the course of 30 years led him to officiate over 5,000 basketball games, including 4 different NCAA Division I women's tournaments. All these experiences taught that little boy that friendship, communication, perseverance, all were part of his upbringing. They were all things that came from family being able to have a place where he could be supported and engage in activities that he just found really valuable and a large hobby. Because of the YMCA, he spent his time figuring out how to improve, or today, that little boy, because of the YMCA, spends his day, every day, on Railroad Avenue, trying to figure out how to improve the financial capacity of individual members of Peninsula Credit Union. This community is a small town with a city council, who I know all of you are committed to improving the community and making the town a better place, not for yourselves, not for today, not just for the community that we know, but for economic development and for generations to come. that little boy stands in front of you tonight to say thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Rick Haas.
Rob and I grew up going to Y Camp at Spirit Lake. It was awesome.
Thank you, Rick.
Tom Davis.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. Thank you. The YMCA does what it does very well. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't create public policy. That's your job. So your job doesn't end with the gifting, if you will, or the leasing. Your job is to continue to grow this community. The YMCA doesn't do any land use, zoning, doesn't create any economic policies, doesn't create traffic patterns, and doesn't realize growth expectations. They simply take care of the people in this community who are young, who are in need, and they will do that very well. There's absolutely no reason to think otherwise. The YMCA has an almost unblemished record in doing so. But they will not succeed, and they cannot succeed, without public policies that support growth in this community. And some of that growth will be coming in the form of, I would like to think of the Shelton Hills project, where we're going to have a little bit more residential growth and also commercial retail business growth. So while we're all excited about this, and rightfully so, please understand that this is not the end. This is clearly the beginning. And I hope that you'll take it upon yourself to make sure that we move on from this. We actually use this as a foundation and a launching pad to make ourselves a better community, not only for the children, but also for our economy and also for future generations. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
No more public comment.
Okay.
We've got one here.
Mike Olson.
Mike Olson. My observation is on how this came about with the negotiations between the attorneys. And my only concern is that this is going to set a precedent for future developments, as Tom mentioned about Shelton Hills. And you may very well find yourself in the same position again, where there's a greater good for the public, such as maybe Shelton Hills donates land for a school. And you guys are going to be in the same position, battling over a lease agreement, services and such. And I caution you to not cave in to, attorneys who have their interest of their clients at stake, rather than the benefit for what the city really gets. This is public land you're giving. I just worry that most developers come in and they always want something for nothing. And you have staff that's professional, and I urge you to listen to them and not continue to give the farm away much more than you already have. I support the YMCA. I think it's great, but I've always been a proponent of, if you're going to develop, you pay for your development, no matter what it is. So I just urge you to keep that in mind as you go forward for the next project that comes along, comes along like this. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
No more.
Okay. Okay, so comments?
I'd like to make one final comment before we move this forward, and that's just that I would hope that the community can recognize the efforts made by the city, by the staff, by the YMCA, by the volunteers. This has been a thoughtful and intense process, and it began last summer, well, even before that, but the memorandum of understanding began last summer, and we've been working diligently since that time to make sure that we as a city protect the residents' interests, while also looking forward to the opportunity this poses for our community. And so I would just like to extend my gratitude to everyone who's been involved in this process, and I look forward to seeing where we move from here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Judy. Anybody else? Okay.
Seeing no further comment, I move to approve the land lease agreement with South Sound YMCA and authorize the mayor to sign.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the lease agreement with the YMCA. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
It only begins.